Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be discussing today how nonprofits, associations, and corporations are coping during COVID-19. I'm Sherry Whitworth, the Managing Director for Public Affairs and Advocacy at FiscalNote. FiscalNote and our team of reporters and editors at CQ Roll Call are actively monitoring the coronavirus outbreak and the effects it is having on politics and policy, our customers, and the industries that they serve. To see the most up-to-date and comprehensive monitoring of the virus and how governments in both the US and the EU are responding, you can visit our coronavirus website. It's coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. We've made much of our coverage available there free of charge to help you navigate through the crisis. You can also sign up for a daily newsletter and learn more about how FiscalNote can help your organization monitor the politics and policy around COVID-19. Again, if you're interested, please check out coronavirus.fiscalnote.com. Okay, I've got just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A box and a chat box. If you don't see those, there's three little dots. You can click on that, and if you want to see one or the other. You can use either to submit questions during the webinar. If you wish to direct your question to one of our panelists in particular, please note that in your question. And also feel free to submit your questions at any time. We're going to try to get to as many as possible during our 1 hour that we have together. We're also recording the session, so afterwards, if you're on this call, you will receive a recorded version. Everyone today should have entered in mute mode. But if you were not, please, with the exception of our panelists, make sure that you are on mute for the benefit of our audience and for the future audio that we'll have later. All right, well, today I'm happy to be joined by three industry experts who will help guide our conversation, and they're going to share their unique insights. They will also answer your questions. Our panel is comprised of these three experts from the nonprofit, association, and corporate public affairs sectors. First up, we have Jan Masaoka. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the California Association of Nonprofits. CalNonprofits is a statewide policy alliance and the voice for California's nonprofit community. Jan was named Nonprofit Executive of the Year by Nonprofit Times and is an 8-time designee on the 50 most influential list of people in the nonprofit sector nationwide. Prior to this role, Jan was the Executive Director of Compass Point, another nonprofit that does consulting and training, and she founded Blue Avocado Magazine, a practical, fun, food for thought online publication for nonprofits. Also today, we have Mary Kate Cunningham, CAE. She serves as Vice President of Public Policy at the American Society of Association Executives. In this role, she oversees ASAE's federal, state, and local advocacy efforts on behalf of the 46,000 trade association, professional society, and industry partner members. Mary Kate oversees ASAE's PAC and the Power of A program, which is a program that highlights how associations make America stronger in every industry in every state to improve the economy and to improve society overall. Before coming to ASAE, Mary Kate also worked at the House Armed Services Committee, in the Communications Office, and on the C-Power Subcommittee. Doug Pinkham rounds out our panel. He is the President of the Public Affairs Council. Doug was elected to head the council in 1997. Under his leadership, the council has expanded its membership, online services, research on emerging public affairs trends, conferences, and global public affairs programs. Before joining the council, Doug was the Vice President of Communications for the American Gas Association, representing natural gas distribution companies. So thank you. I'm very happy to be joined by such a nice panel here. And we're going to jump straight into the questions. Our first question is going to be directed at all three of you. And we'll start with Doug, then go to Mary Kate, and then to Jan. So Doug, thanks for being with us. Speaking on behalf of your organization, can you articulate how you spend most of your time these days as it relates to COVID-19? Do you see your focus more on recovery aid, grassroots advocacy, thought leadership, fundraising, or providing other resources to your members?
We're primarily a training and expertise organization. Our members are both big companies, a lot of trade and professional associations, universities, and nonprofits. So it's a pretty diverse group. We typically are doing about 120 live events a year. So as you can imagine, we've canceled quite a few. Lucky for us, we got through 3 of our largest events before the middle of March. But like most other associations, there's a real financial hit associated with having to change your methods of delivering services to members. We've been focusing a lot on remote training. We've been doing this with workshops for about 4 years now. So fortunately, we've had lots of practice there and had some real success. So it wasn't completely foreign to our member organizations, but we've been going a few steps further, realizing that for various events, you have to customize the type of remote training you're doing. For a bunch of digital advocacy people, you can make it more technical, you can make it longer in terms of a virtual program than you can for our board members and for senior level people. So you use kind of the right technology, and we've been learning that and just finding other ways of delivering information on best practices and emerging issues. A lot of casework from our member organizations who are dealing with not only health-related challenges in their workforce or customers or position in the marketplace, but also just the economic consequences of the pandemic, and doing benchmarking around that. And in our spare time, we've been trying to do a bit of thought leadership. I finally got an article written last night that was maybe 2 weeks late. But nevertheless, trying to get out there and talk about the trends, the issues, the growing importance of public affairs in both public and private sectors.
Thanks. Mary Kate, would you like to be next?
Yeah, that sounds good. Since early March, our public policy shop has been, I think, all COVID all the time. Since we saw a mention of the concern for the travel and tourism industry, we wanted to weigh in with the White House and Congress, reminding them from the beginning, associations are so closely tied to travel and tourism. The way that revenue comes from conferences, that just how critical that is. And now what we've been entirely focused on is trying to add 501c6 associations to the Paycheck Protection Program. So we've gotten some headway on that in the last couple of weeks, but trying to get that over the finish line. And our team is really focused on how to help our members on the advocacy front and ASAE in general. We've been providing a lot of free programming for professionals to figure out how do you transition your conference to virtual, how do you do scenario planning, forecasting for the future right now. So we have a lot of resources in general because this is what our members are really focused on right now. It's a very serious time for the industry, as I'm sure everyone on the call knows.
Jan, how about from your perspective, from the pure nonprofit perspective?
Yeah, thanks. Well, we're statewide. We're just in California. And I just learned a great new term, Zombie. That's the name for a person who's turned into a zombie from being on too many online events. And so I would say that, we're just advocating all the time. And part of that advocacy, is we have a specific set of requests we have of California state government and organizing legislators. To support those efforts. And part of that is also doing town halls. So we had an idea of offering to legislators that we would co-host town halls with them so that they could meet nonprofits in their districts. And about 3 days after we said that, we had 16 of them scheduled. So now we're kind of exhausted from doing so many of them. But, nonprofits are, I mean, as other people's members are really struggling, and our end of supporting them is really focused around advocacy.
Thanks, Janet. And we already learned something, Zumbi. Okay, so first learning. Let's go to the second question. PPP is affecting each of your member audiences to a very large degree. Mary Kate, we're going to start with you. Can you speak to any specific positioning and how you and kind of help you might provide to people that are listening as we move into this fourth round of funding?
Sure. A lot of what we focused on is getting every association possible to weigh in with their elected officials. We found that there was a sense by some members of Congress that associations would be fine. They had a lot of money. I think sometimes they see the biggest associations and assume that's all the groups. So getting associations to tell their story was really important. We did a sign-on letter with more than 4,300 organizations across the country, and that helped. I think Congress is hearing from associations more than ever right now. There's a lot of tax staff that probably didn't know exactly the difference between C6 and the other groups, and now are well aware. And we've seen a lot of new legislation in the past week supportive of this. And some bipartisan legislation, which is great. But the struggle is we don't know the timeline exactly for Congress. We think the House is coming back next week, but we're not sure when this next package will be, if there will be a fifth bill or not. So we are entirely focused on trying to get into this package now.
Jan or Doug, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Sure. Well, nonprofits, I mean, to oversimplify, there are kind of two extremes. One is the nonprofits that are in essential services, like nonprofit healthcare clinics, food banks, Meals on Wheels. And on the other end of the spectrum, right, we have nonprofit museums and theaters. So on one hand, we have people that are just, putting everything they have into meeting immediate needs. And they're still having trouble. They still can't get enough masks. They need contract relief because they're doing different kinds of work than their contracts originally called for, and they need flexibility to be able to do that. So, for example, they're doing fewer TB tests and more COVID-19 tests, and they need to get paid for that. And on the other hand, we have in particular arts organizations that have completely shut down. They're not able to have their fundraising events. They can't let anybody into their museums. They can't have their stage performances. And so we have, and everything in between. So it's just a great deal of difference between subsectors within the nonprofit community. And I think right now, I think our focus has been on supporting the ones in essential services, because I mean, I talked to one of our members, a health clinic, a primary healthcare clinic that serves pretty much exclusively low-income homeless people. Their cost of masks is $100,000 a month, and that's if they can find them. So, we're working on that stuff at the same time, concerning with particular funding for the performing arts, which is just being killed.
Doug, do you have any other perspective, like from your corporate members?
Well, the first thing I would say is, just because I think it's real important, is that I feel like each of us has a personal responsibility to support one or more nonprofits, both as an organization and individually, and all of us has an equal responsibility to try to pick one or more small businesses that we've benefited from, whether it's a restaurant, a family-owned retail store, whatever. I just think that's important. So many of our members are larger companies, although not all of them, for whom many of these issues don't apply. But we also have some smaller companies, certainly in the consulting realm, and we have a fair number of C3 organizations. And again, I think that C organizations in general, particularly the 4s and 6s, are really misunderstood. And there is not much of an appreciation for the societal good that happens despite all the great efforts by ASAE over the years, or certainly there's not awareness of the business model that associations follow. And I'm glad that work is being done to try to educate people. But for the most part, we're not as involved as Jan and Mary Kate are.
This is Mary Kay. I think that's such a great point. We're trying to see the opportunity in this crisis to do a lot of education about how associations improve society, train the workforce, impact the economy, because we know that there's a huge need to tell that story on a bigger scale. And we saw that with tax reform a little bit, Congress not being aware of the full way that associations have a valuable contribution to society. So that's what a lot of our efforts are going to around. And I hope that that pays dividends in the future, because we know we'll see attacks on associations down the road that we need to fight against.
Yeah, the interesting thing is we did some polling, early, I guess in the last few months. One of the questions is about, what sources of news and information do you trust? And as you can all imagine, with a lot of the media back going on, the news media has fallen a bit in terms of public respect for being a trustworthy source. And where people support mostly is friends and family for their news, but associations were way up there. In fact, slightly ahead of the news media. So associations not only have an important role serving their constituencies and having a public benefit, but are being listened to more and more by average people. And I think that fact should hopefully get the attention of Congress too, as we're all trying to work to tell our story there.
Great point.
Right, let's move on to the next question. We're going to talk about the mission. And Jan, I want to start with you on this one. Where do you see the mission of your members coming into play during this COVID time?
Well, I mentioned some of that in terms of the differences between kind of the subsectors within the nonprofit community, but another way to think about it is what constituencies do different kinds of nonprofits work in. And I think, one of the things we're really seeing is that, the inequities in society are just being revealed to much greater degrees than they ever have before. And as a result, those inequities and how they affect nonprofits are also really clear. So the nonprofits in particular that are in poorer communities, that are in rural communities, and that are in communities of color are just getting so much less support than those that are in wealthier, whiter, and more urban communities. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to try to advocate in particular for those that are not able to access the resources as much as others. And so it's more about what kind of constituencies do people serve. So we're seeing, for example, a dental clinic in a wealthier area may be closed, but their patients have more access to technology, for example, to be able to have, to the degree that you can, virtual dental clinic visits. In California, there's still 2 million households that don't have broadband access at home. So a lot of the technologies, things that are possible for lots of people are not possible for, and so the nonprofits that serve them are also having just to struggle a lot more than people whose constituencies really do have good technology access. So I think, yes, it's partly about activities, as I mentioned, but it's also partly about location and constituency.
Doug or Mary Kate?
Sure,
Go ahead.
I can jump in. We've seen, obviously the medical groups, of course, are at the forefront, supporting their members, trying to keep them safe, but all types of associations have been really involved in this. The Distillers and the Consumer Brands Association helping distilleries change over to make hand sanitizer. Some of the paper product associations ensuring we all have access to the much needed paper goods now. The demand for blood donations, blood banks really supporting, and all potential therapies for COVID-19. And all across the board, even, gosh, this is a sad one, but the funeral directors have been really instrumental in increased demand that's in New York and different states. So there are so many, so we see associations doing what they do best now, convening industries and professions and enabling really great work.
I mean, I think what I would add to that is that, within our membership, we have just about every corporate and association healthcare discipline there is, and there's many. But just as one quick example, my current chairman is a guy named Pete Sloan, who runs government affairs for McKesson, which is one of the top 10 biggest companies in the country, and is the biggest drug distributor and wholesaler. And he is personally involved, as is a number of people in his company, and just helping the government and the coronavirus task forces, and there are actually several of them. There's not just the Pence one, there's another one that works behind the scenes, run by a lot of Pentagon people who really know logistics, but basically trying to source protective gear from around the world and get it delivered to the right place, and also trying to help locate hard to find drugs at a fair price from around the world. And and he and working with other companies using logistic skills, which is something the private sector does exceedingly well. But as an interesting corollary to that, he knows, and my friends in the pharmaceutical industry know, that among all the different industry sectors right now, drug companies are held in the lowest regard in terms of public trust. So many people in pharma are trying to do the right thing and save lives, but they're also feeling that these efforts might actually make people open their eyes to realize what they contribute to the health and well-being of Americans. So they feel like, they're happy to have the opportunity to volunteer and try to help the government do its job.
Thanks, Doug. I think I would agree with that. A lot of, to Mary Kate's point too, like people don't know a lot about associations and what their value is, or some of the industries that now are coming to be the people doing the great things for us all. So that's great. I want to move a little bit to the future, and especially with nonprofits and associations. And Mary Kate, I'll start with you. Do you have, what is your personal thought about what the association and nonprofit world could look like after some of this has been resolved?
I think it's going to be tough. We see that in other issues like this, associations have lagged behind the general economy in coming back from something like this. So I think we'll probably see more mergers and acquisitions among associations, and they'll have to be tighter, more nimble types of organizations. Really goes back to why we need access to the Paycheck Protection Program to help save a lot of these groups or keep them in action, doing their great work. But I think that we'll see a lot of kind of adapting to the new environment.
Doug, I know some of your members tend to be the larger associations. Do you have a different perspective on that, or do you share that?
Yeah, and we've got a lot of small associations, and we have, universities, and we have environmental groups and others, because, again, we're not an advocacy group. I think, and you'll never would guess that I was an English literature major when I spent my time talking about finances, but I'm treasurer for another nonprofit, and I obviously focus a lot on finances and running our organization. I think you're going to see a real sea change in associations in particular, and how they manage finances, their efforts to diversify their sources of revenue. For example, I mean, for years, going back, a long time ago, most income came from dues. A lot of entrepreneurial associations started doing large trade shows, conferences, providing accreditation and other services, and in many cases make much more money from those services than from dues. And the problem is, of course, some of those services, especially involving meetings, which can be very lucrative, aren't taking place, and there's a real financial hit. And with trade shows, same deal. And some of them, and we are one of them, benefited from being able to invoke a force majeure clause for one event in particular. But the further we get away from the beginning of the crisis and from perhaps what the peak is, and I'm not even sure, frankly, we're at the peak, it will be harder and harder to claim force majeure. And because people may forget there is a severe economic recession going on at the same time, because we're all concerned about the health concerns. And that means a lot of organizations have a ban on non-essential travel, not just for health reasons, but for financial reasons. And it's going to be a long time before a lot of those events are profitable again. And so I just think that, I mean, we'll get back there at some point, but I do think there's going to be some real changes in how companies look at finances. One of the problems you have with, like, for instance, when you're trying to do a dues increase, or you're, internally saying we need to have more reserves, and an organization has 4 months, and I think the average, as I remember at ASAE, is around 6 months worth of expenses in reserve. I mean, that can change year to year. We're fortunate enough to have quite a bit more than that. But, you always get some people on your board who say, yeah, but, if you've got money, you should be delivering it in services, or perhaps you cut the dues, right? I think you're not going to hear that anymore, because I think people realize that associations can't raise capital in the same way companies can. And it's hard to go to the bank for a loan. So it's hard to go to the government for a loan, even tougher to do that. So when you're out of money, you're out of money. And, I feel bad for friends who run associations where they've only got, before the crisis, 2 to 3 months worth of reserves, and that's gone. So, there are some that are just not going to survive, but I do feel there will be a real conservative, and I mean that in a financial sense, move toward, how associations make money and spend money. And I think that will change some of the services that are offered, or, how associations spend money in the future.
This is Jan. Those are really good points, Doug. And I really appreciate your, this issue of not being able to have events is affecting so many people in so many different ways. I'm hoping that I think that people do see more clearly the importance of government than they may have before. It's clear that, really only government can step in with the kind of dollars to, say, provide the Paycheck Protection Program or the EIDL or a lot of these other things that they just can't be really addressed adequately through private donations, for example. And I think I'm hoping that in addition, well, I know that in addition, actually, nonprofits are also seeing the importance of advocacy. In the 2008 recession, there were a lot of areas where nonprofits were excluded from benefits to other employers, for example. But, actually in California, 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. So one of the things we have worked very hard on, and along with our national partners, is to make sure that, for example, benefits, COVID-related benefits to employers include nonprofits who are important employers, that benefits to commercial tenants are also provided to nonprofits, which are commercial tenants. So I think that we're seeing, it's interesting to me how much of an uptick we've seen in membership in the last 6 weeks. And I think that's because people are realizing that the importance of advocacy may be heightened to them, even though clearly the opportunity to go to a conference is something that's gone.
I agree with that. I think there is an even greater appreciation for the importance of advocacy, that at a time like this, when everyone is clamoring for support, for understanding, for financial assistance, if people have never heard of you, if you've never had a presence in Washington or at the state capitol, it's really going to be tough to get yourself well known now and to get your story told. It is one of the best preemptive moves any industry or profession can take is to form an association. And certainly within a company, I think there's a growing sense that it's as important to business strategy as many aspects of finance and marketing. So we're hopefully not going to have to prove our worth for a while. The question is whether there'll be enough dollars in budgets to support the people who do this important work. But I'm delighted to hear that your membership's gone up. That's great. And for that reason, that says a lot about your reputation.
And to echo some of Doug's comments about non-dues revenue, I think we saw years ago an effort to tax investment income, and we know that there are other efforts by the Hill and administrations to tax related business income. So that's something that is so critical now. Now is the rainy day, as Doug said, that you need those reserves. But that's something we're always vigilant in having to possibly fight against. The taxation of related business income, especially, becomes more important to the revenue structure of an organization.
Yeah, that's true.
And Mary Kate, we just got a question about revenue. So I want to direct that or insert that right now. It says, with this new financial structure of associations, what do you think the new percent of revenue membership dues should be?
I think that will have to depend on the temperature that each organization takes of their membership. That's a good question, but before this, there was obviously such a push for non-dues revenue, and I think that Doug's point was also great about it's harder for associations to raise that type of capital. We saw even in the economic injury disaster loan program that loans over 200,000 have to have a personal guarantee. Well, that just doesn't work for associations. Are you going to put your house up for your organization? So I think I don't think that there's a magic number. But I bet that ASAE will do some interesting research on that through our research foundation that I can definitely share back with folks.
It's so hard to say what's normal or what's average with associations because everyone's business model is a little different. It depends on your industry. There are some unknown industries that are huge, and you would with an association because they just happen to have a trade show that is the biggest game anywhere, and they generate 70 or 80% of their revenue, and through that event. And if that event is in May, June, or July, they're in real trouble this year. They might be able to claim force majeure and not have to pay for hotels and so forth, but they're not getting the revenue either. So. But on the other hand, they've been successful for many years with that. But I'm sure they're going to have discussions at their future board meetings to say, is there a way we can get that 70 or 80% down to 40% so that, if things go wrong again, it's not going to be, threatening to put us out of business. There are some associations that are still financially member funded through dues, and that. Ironically, in the last 20 years, that's been sort of frowned on, because, it means you have to raise your dues every year, every couple of years. But whether that's good or bad, just frankly depends on how well your profession or industry is doing in the health crisis and in the economy, because there's some sectors that are doing just fine, and there are some that are doing horribly. There's just no magic answer. I do think and Mary Kate, maybe you've got updated data to what I was referring to earlier about reserve ratios. I think that's something that, I think is a rule of thumb. I mean, I don't know if it's changed, but I do know ASAE used to say roughly 6 months worth of your expenses in reserve, should be enough for most people. Do you know if that's changed? Or, I mean, I've seen numbers all over the place.
I'm going to check our operating ratio report, definitely. I know our John Graham, our CEO, former CEO that just passed, he used to say, if you've seen one association, you've seen one association. So it does definitely speak to the diversity. But what we've also seen is that there are organizations with strong reserves, but that individual board does not want to go into those reserves because they want to protect the future. So I think it really depends on board leadership as well.
What we did, and just so if anybody is, I just will say is that we are blessed with having, very healthy reserves, which is something I inherited 20 some years ago but have maintained. And what we do when we're getting opposition is we started a program where we said, okay, like we had roughly say 12, 13 months in reserve, is to say, okay, we don't want to go below 9 months, but let's take a certain amount of those, what we would call excess reserves, not all of it, but some of it, and invest it in new programs. And we've done this 3 separate times, get a lot of input from the board, you do research. As you know, a lot of new services don't pay for themselves initially, or sometimes they're something that is never going to pay for itself. A lot of the public opinion polling we've done, which doesn't make money, but is great for name recognition and helping members get the right data they need for various purposes. That's been paid for out of reserves. And I find that helps cancel out those people who think we shouldn't have reserves by showing that we're able to do both, invest in our future and still have a very healthy rainy day fund. But we can only do that because we have an executive committee that has been supportive of that notion of building up those reserves when you have a good year and not feeling obligated to spend it all.
All right. I want to pull it back to a couple minutes ago. We all were talking about people doing a little more advocacy and that sort of thing. Jan, you mentioned that you were kind of taking the lead in your organization to set up town hall meetings. So this whole idea of virtual advocacy, do you see this continuing and playing a bigger role in what you're doing as a nonprofit and fostering that? And I'll do the same question to Mary Kate and Doug. And do you have other examples of how you've gone virtual to kind of make these things happen? That was going to Jan. Maybe you're on mute.
I can jump in first if Jan might.
Okay.
So we are, I think all of us obviously are trying to furiously lobby Congress from our couches this spring, which is not how I expected to spend my spring vacation. But what we've done, and I'm sure a ton of other groups have done, is the virtual town halls have been really successful. I'm surprised by the members of Congress are getting really good at them now. So that's been useful. We are planning a big grassroots week that will be, each day will be something virtual. But giving people none of this is like brand new tactics, but we've found that people have more time to do stuff on social and tagging their members of Congress. They are, because this is such a weird time, I think people are very focused on how they can do advocacy virtually. And I think setting up meetings has worked as well.
Thanks. This is Jan. My mute button wasn't working for a second there. You know, I think that one of the things we found is that it's easier for legislators to agree to, say, a 1-hour town hall meeting with constituents than it is for them to agree to an in-person meeting in the state capitol or even in their own districts. And it's also a lot easier to get 300 nonprofits to a town hall meeting online than it is to get them to an in-person meeting. So that ability to interact more directly with their elected officials, I think, has just been a huge plus in terms of the more willingness for everybody to participate in online stuff. Now, the day before yesterday, yesterday, the California State Assembly reopened. And so all the members of our houses are now back in Sacramento, back meeting in person. So we're really wondering how it's going to go. We do know that they started holding hearings. Just the legislators and their staff are present. So, for example, there will be, you know, a 2-hour period in which we know they're taking public comment, and then everybody has to line up virtually to make their 1 or 2 minute comments. So in that regard, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, because, and I also feel that virtual advocacy tends to favor old relationships and kind of, you know, it's easier to work online with somebody you already know than it is to meet new people. And so that's kind of one of our fears, is that they'll tend to make everybody on both sides of advocacy more likely to stick with the known quantities rather than to be meeting new kinds of people.
I also think
that, Jan.
You're right. I also think there's you know, there was already a shift toward digital advocacy. In other words, not direct lobbying, but various grassroots and other outreach using communications tools. And that sort of shift and the growth of that area has been enormous in recent years. And if anything, this is just accelerating it because there's so many tools available on social media. Certainly, we've had email for a long time. You know, I was one of those people who used to think those issue-oriented print ads, you know, in the back of National Journal were just a royal waste of money because there was no way of knowing whether anybody ever saw your ad. Well, now, you know, issue ads are inexpensive, they're flexible, you can use animation, you can measure how many people saw them. It's digital isn't replacing lobbying or even virtual lobbying. It's supplementing it, but it's able to step in even more at a time like this. And again, there's a bonus, as you said, that people have a little more time because they're not traveling to meetings. So we're seeing tremendous growth in the digital.
You want to add, Mary Kate?
I think I do wonder how much of this will continue past COVID, because I think, to the point earlier, it's easier for a scheduler to get someone, the ROI for the number of members they can meet on a Zoom town hall is better. And then I actually like it in some ways for helping engage my own members outside the Beltway with some of our grassroots events, because it's hard not to look Beltway focused when you host events, but would be a great way to get people around the country involved.
I mean, it's normal this time of year, in fact, May, when so many fly-ins take place from associations and from companies. My goodness, if you ever try to book a hotel for any other event in May, forget it because of all the fly-ins. Well, 99, probably 100% of them have been canceled or have been replaced by virtual fly-ins. But already we were seeing some enterprising associations in recent years doing, in-district fly-ins on the assumption that it's easier to get the attention of a member and their staff when you do it near home than in Washington. And sometimes that really works. So I just think that people are being more open-minded about there's more than one way to do outreach. And if we have 3 or 4 different tools at our disposal that our employees or members are comfortable with, then we can kind of mix it up. And based on the situation in the world, the economy, and certainly during a pandemic, it becomes clear that you have more limited options. But I think it's smart to not rely on just one old traditional approach to doing outreach.
Well, I think it's interesting too that the initial adoption of digital tools happened when anthrax hit the Capitol Hill offices and no one was accepting mail. So that's when they first started, it kind of forced everyone's hand to move to digital. And then I think over the years, that waned a little bit, even though it was adopted by more organizations. It wasn't the thing everyone was talking about. Everybody was going back to in person. This hits, the people that were pre-set with a digital tool, now still have that at their hand. And I wonder, like, offices opening up and wanting to be meeting with handshaking and, with all these people in and out, if that will even in the new normal post-COVID, if those kind of things will be diminished. And it sounds like you're both saying that, this is easier. You can see maybe more people kind of continuing with this, obviously doing this in person, but this actually help matters and help some of your members get in front of legislators a little more easily.
Yeah. New technologies, new ways of doing things. I think I may have said this earlier. They rarely replace an old way. It becomes additive, and for different situations, different demographic groups you're reaching, different members, you want to have a variety of strategies available to do outreach, and you want to sometimes be able to experiment. So I think a lot of people, when digital came along, said, well, that's the end of, shoe leather lobbying, which is what we used to say. And it wasn't the end, because there's a lot of situations where there's no substitute for a face-to-face meeting. And I think that those will still take place. Now, everyone in the room may be wearing masks for a while, but that's okay. And I think eventually we'll be back to, if not normal, back to, a certain amount of face-to-face. But as people experiment with new ways, they'll learn and say, well, and sometimes, and this includes members of Congress, Congress have been doing virtual town halls for a long time. And I've read some of the Congressional Management Foundation surveys. Members love it because not only is it convenient, it means if a crazy person starts speaking, it's really easy to shut them down. You don't have to drag them out of the hall. And so they don't find it as threatening. They find it helpful. And certainly easy to schedule. So it'll be a different mix. It won't be back the way it was, but it won't be so drastically different as what some people would predict.
We've got an audience question. With the limited staff capacity, where should organizations and nonprofits be focusing their federal advocacy efforts right now on COVID relief? Should it be House, Senate, committee staff versus personal offices? ? Who wants to jump in on that first? Mary Kate?
Yes. So actually, first I've got some, I pulled one of our investment policy reports just to go back to that and before I forget. the reserve ratio, it sounds like the rule of thumb is still 6 months, but in reality, many organizations are aiming at higher. 69% of respondents maintained at least 50% of their annual budget, and then a third, more than a third, maintained a full year's budget in reserves. So I'm back to Doug's point about what the industry standard is there. And Sherry, what was your question for me just now? The top one?
No. This was from an audience member that says, with limited staff capacity, where should organizations and nonprofits be focusing their federal advocacy efforts as it relates to COVID relief packages? Should it be House, Senate, committee staff, personal offices? Do you have some input there?
Yeah. What we've heard, the last packages were really leadership driven. It depends on, and I think committee chairs were very frustrated. They weren't more involved in the process. And there's an effort to try to involve them more now. Obviously, there are questions about how much committees can be in person right now as Congress tries to come back. But leadership, and then for at least for our issues that had been the small business committees, chairs and rankings. I think I'm curious what other folks think about that question. The $1 million question.
Well, I'm going to throw in a follow-up to that. With regard to holding either town halls or Zoom meetings, especially other Zoom or WebEx or however you're doing your meetings, can others weigh in on challenges getting your points across in those meetings with policymakers? Typically, with our fly-in, we'd spend a fair amount of time prepping individuals and having groups practice. This seems harder with people joining online. Anybody have experience there they'd like to share?
Yes, it's harder online. Yeah, we have a meeting this afternoon with some California state folks, and so we have a prep call, but it's, one more thing that people have to participate in. It's kind of, it doesn't feel the same. So it's definitely more difficult. And there are also some people that, you want to bring in front of legislators that just aren't that comfortable with online technology.
Well, we've got about, and I would just add in there, I think you still have to go the extra step and prep. We're helping people with planning online fly-ins or, replacing fly-ins. And I think you can't skip the point of training people and having the pre-meeting. Even for this webinar that's only 1 hour, we had a 20-minute prep meeting, so I think that is still a critical element that, I would just, to our audience question there, I would just say you still have to do the prep, get people prepped, and make sure they've got your talking points. And there's a cadence there of who's going to speak when, because the worst thing is when everyone's jumping on top of each other and, wasting some valuable time there.
We had one association that did a virtual prep room during the day, during their virtual fly-in, where people could jump on and talk to their staff, and their team just stayed in that room and answered questions. That seems like that's great member service.
I want to go back to the reserve question for just a second. I think that the old reserve idea, was about, various kinds of things that we thought would start and then end. Like in California, that, we always think about earthquakes, right, and wildfires. And I think this is going to be different. I think even if, for example, it's open for business, I still think that in the fall and probably even in the spring of next year, people aren't going to be as willing to go to in-person events. So, I think that there will be I think all of our constituencies will be different. There'll be new players and there'll be a lot of people that have gone under. So that will also affect that. But I don't know. I think that that idea that, it's going to jump back, I think we're going to have to think out a longer period of time. And in addition to just kind of making it through for right now, I think thinking about Doug's points about needing to change not, what kind of revenue to be looking for, but also how much revenue may be different. And So I think that it's probably too early to make really, serious plans, but it's definitely not too early to start thinking about things that we haven't thought about before in previous kind of disaster-like scenarios.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that how will this experience change our behavior forever? Will it, like, someone compared this to, we now think it's normal to take off your shoes at the airport, and that never was. And our behavior changed, and people will want to stay home more and engage virtually and not travel even when it's safe. And big questions for the industry.
Okay, we've only got 9 minutes left. So I'm going to pivot. We have a couple more audience questions, but I want to pivot around. We're going to end with a positive, but if we can just talk about, for years, crisis communication's been really a hot topic at all, conferences and board meetings and leadership seminars. So from your organization's perspective, how would you say your organization was prepared? Number one, what was your biggest gap? And, what will you do differently based either on that gap or, some other unforeseen? What will your organization do differently? Doug, could we start with you and everybody give a minute or two response to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think for us, I feel proud overall with how we responded. Again, I think it helped that we've been doing, virtual workshops in the past, so we knew we'd be doing more of that. I think for me, the biggest surprise and as a result was a gap was how quickly things moved. I mean, remember what it was like in late March and early April? The person who does communications and marketing for me said, Doug, it'd be great if you could record a couple videos because we have an on-house camera person. One just, saying to the membership, here's where we are, we're here to help you, different way of doing business. This is when we were still in the office. And so we shot that and she says, well, you know what, on the eventuality that we're not going to be able to come to work, whether that might happen, could you record another one saying, now that we're working remotely, yada, yada. And I'm like, okay, we're probably not going to use that for like another 6 weeks. Well, like 3 days later was our last day in the office. And so we used that video. I wish I'd recorded 3 or 4 more. And I wish we had done more advanced prep work or at the first signs of the crisis so that we would be better armed from a communication standpoint. We're still able to do this stuff, remotely and so forth. I'm going to be shooting a video with my phone. But that's, for us, that was the biggest gap. I feel, other than that, though, I feel like we did very well in terms of trying to keep the business going, dealing with both the health crisis and the financial problems, at least so far.
Jan or Mary Kate?
I think in terms of communications with our members and our constituents, I think we were well prepared because that's something we do all the time. I think that though that, the most important connections to have statewide changed. And so we had, been, very good relationships with a lot of the people, but then some new people came into the forefront that we didn't have them. And that's been a good lesson for us.
I'm thinking about, I'm so glad we instituted smart technology changes for staff because a couple of years ago, we would not have been able to move to remote so seamlessly. And there was a lot of grumbling when people had to move all their drives to the cloud, but now they're happy. So glad about that, but it's just still our fly-in was supposed to be the week after the stay home order. So just still figuring out the best way to engage all those people is our challenge.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for bearing, some of your, maybe a slight weakness. Now let's move to something positive. If you all could project your best outcomes from this worldwide pandemic, what would it look like? What is the best thing that you think, outcome that you hope happens in your most positive, good vibe way? And I think I'll start with Jan this time.
Yeah, but I'm the ultimate pessimist. You have to remember that. Well, although I do think it's important to remember that sort of, phrase I like is that, pessimism is about kind of assessment of the situation, and optimism is an orientation of the spirit. So I like to think that I'm a pessimist and an optimist at the same time, all the time. I think that the possible, I mean, I think we're just talking about silver linings. We're not talking about overall being being good things. But I think that the importance of government doing the right thing is more apparent, will become more apparent to people. And that's not just domestically, but also internationally. And I think that who is in office matters, and people who may not have thought that before are now thinking that. So I'm thinking that possibly, people will pay more attention to voting, to more attention to who's elected, and more attention to the role of government, making sure that government really, serves communities, and serves the people that on the ground that really need that kind of help. That's my faint hope.
Mary Kate?
I think one interesting ramification is it seems to be leaders are all a bit, they're leading with vulnerability in a way that maybe we wouldn't have before. We're being more transparent. And I think that is always good for moving forward. And then also, I really hope that we can galvanize the association community together to help explain to the public and elected officials what associations do and how we are, I think, stronger by association.
And Doug, wrap it up for us.
Sure. Well, first I'd say I agree 100% with what Ann and Mary Kate said. I think those are all extremely important points. So I'll make two quick ones. One is I think, many of us have studied crisis communications and given speeches and talked about that in our various organizations. I think we're seeing living proof that being candid with people and being straight and giving them bad news and not sugarcoating it is the right way. When you look at the approval ratings for both certain Democratic and Republican governors, like Cuomo and DeWine and some others, and then for Anthony Fauci for just being honest, I think people, they don't panic. They can take bad news, and I'm hoping that politicians are paying attention to that phenomena. But I guess just in a general sense, I'm hoping that people here and around the world realize that it's an interconnected planet, and that what each of us does affects other people, that it can't be America first any more than it could be Great Britain first. Everybody is, whether we like it or not, our success and our prosperity and our health is dependent on maintaining positive relations with other countries and other types of people and cultures, some of which we don't understand. But that if we can keep other people from having disasters, we're also helping ourselves and doing a good thing for the world. So, that's kind of a spiritual thing, but that's what I hope comes out of all of this.
I love it. I think that's a great point to leave everybody with. It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Jan, Mary Kate, and Doug, for taking time to participate today. Thanks to the audience that stuck with us through this hour. We know your time is also valuable, and we appreciate you spending that with us. Again, we'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar. And if you'd like to learn anything more about how FiscalNote can help your organization monitor the policy and politics that's going around COVID-19 or any other issues, please visit our website at FiscalNote.com. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you, and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.